Well, the Greeks held that the visual arts were the imitation of life, but the computer arts are the imitation of creation itself. Thank you very much.
My name is Bert Sutherland. I first met Wes in 1962, I guess it was, when I came out of the Navy back to grad school at MIT and was lucky enough to program on the TX2, which you have heard so much about. My story about it was that it took quite a while for me to realize that most computers were not shut down on Wednesday for rewiring. It was really quite a marvelous old machine. Well, to introduce Wes, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what he's been doing recently, because it goes very nicely with the title of his talk, which was Early and Small. Wes is a real designer with a sense of cleanliness in the things he designs. And in the last few years, Wes has been interested in Chinese input to computers. And he has built and developed a very clever, very efficient and swift scheme for touch typing Chinese characters. And when I went to see this for the first time, when Wes was becoming associated with Sutherland Sproul a couple years ago, I walked into his Manhattan apartment to see his computer and his input keyboard. And he had the keyboard handmade, painted a fiery red with a nice gold dragon on it. It was rather much, I would say, a descendant of Doug's five-finger keyboard. This thing, you can touch it up and down in quite a variety of ways for one hand. And his computer to run this thing was the Sinclair Timex. So let me introduce Wes Clark.
Actually, that Timex, the Z80 stuff, is really quite a good engine, you know. Just have to learn how to escape from the operating system. Well, all right. Did you know, by the way, that Bert and his brother Ivan were among the first, perhaps the first, programmers of microcomputers? I'm referring to their experience with Ed Berkeley's, was it called Simple Simon or just Simon? I've forgotten that relay job. It was very influential. I saw it on the cover of a Scientific American article, and I can assure you that it influenced my life a great deal. And as I understand it, Bert and Ivan met Berkeley and rewired a bit of it and put in a game. Pardon?
Put in a table lookup multiplier.
A table lookup multiplier. How about that? This was back in 48 or 9. Well, that's fantastic. Well, it is, of course, a great pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm among those who can't turn down Al Perlis 2. It's a very big club, including 800 million Chinese. Al and I were on a tour that Severo organized in 1972 to China. And the Chinese adore Al, as does everybody who knows him. Great wit and charm, as we know. He toasted the vice premier at the Great Hall of the People on one banquet occasion in orange soda pop. And here I am. He said, come on, the main motivation was to get a group photograph of all the old timers, and I thought that was really nifty. wanted to have my picture appearing with these other good old friends, and so here I am. And it's quite a challenge to follow the giants who have spoken so far. I mean, this is really quite a group of people. You know about the unit of facial beauty, I learned this from Ivan, is the millihelen. That's the amount of beauty sufficient to launch one ship. You can also appreciate now that in spoken discourse and exposition, the unit is actually the theoretical unit is the Lamson. This is the product of the clarity and the speed. It's related to information transfer, and in the real sense, not just in the information theoretic sense. Of course, that's much too big a unit, and so we ordinarily use the micro Lamson. And although I can talk fast when I have to, I can really put out a lot of words in a great deal of hurry, you know. But and I can also put out some things with great clarity, especially if there are other people's thoughts, like it is insufficiently considered that man more often requires to be reminded than informed. Wonderful quote of Sam Johnson's. But my product is terrible, especially when I'm trying to communicate my own ideas. So you'll have to bear with me. By the way, this business about rising with authority from beanbags needs one further anecdote. I remember one occasion in which, to his great chagrin, Butler had a bad case of laryngitis and his voice was completely gone for an extended period of time. Nonetheless, in a whisper, it wasn't even a loud one, with great clarity and force, he commanded and reproved clear across the room from a beanbag to great effect. Some of you may remember that period. Well, and here I am, and I'm to talk about the LINC, which was early and small, and to say that almost says it all, because it wasn't a very remarkable machine otherwise, except for the tape unit, perhaps, which needs a bit of further talking. A few years ago, I got a call from somebody representing the ACM IEEE committee, wondering if I would accept, if offered, an Eckert-Mockley Award for computer architecture. I hadn't really heard of I guess I had heard of the award, but I wasn't following it. I'm only an associate member of the IEEE, and forgive me, Adele and others, I dropped my membership to the ACM many, many years ago when it became too mathematical for me to understand. But I thought with this telephone call, somebody had made a mistake. I was supposed to be herewith promoted to the ranks of the grand old men or something or other. The caller told me that the first award had gone to Morris Wilks and the second one to the mythological Bob Barton. Well, you always have to give a new award like that to the award-winning Morris Wilks to season it properly. And I said sure, and I did accept the award just a few years ago in a modest ceremony in Minneapolis. And what I want to make clear, though, is that the machine is really the work of my colleague and friend of many, many years, Charles Molnar, who's here seen in this picture, taken from 1963. At a rack of stuff, part of which is a LINC. By the way, I didn't quite know what I was going to say at this award ceremony. I was expected to give some kind of a talk, and I immediately set about in my new grand old man status of writing my memoirs and putting various reprints and magazine clippings into very dignified boxes on my library shelf and that sort of thing. My workstation in those days was a desk and an IBM Selectric typewriter and a wastebasket. The IBM Selectric is one thing IBM really does well is make typewriters. And I told mostly anecdotes because I had very little else to say. My memoirs only came to a page and a half, double-spaced. And I have the same difficulty here. We're talking about one very specific thing, the LINC. It's pretty much self-explanatory. It's been published fairly well in a book, a book in Computers in Medicine and Biology by Waxman and Stacy, a pretty good description that Charlie and I wrote. By the way, as you can see, even talking at about 30 or 35 microlamsons, you can't gain anything by just raising the volume. I wouldn't be here actually if it weren't for Howard Aiken. This is not just going to be a good old days story about MIT again. There was this other university up the river. I've forgotten what they called it. It was in Cambridge. Anyway, Howard Aiken built a number of machines very early on, as you know. And when I was at Hanford, sitting out there in the desert in eastern Washington, waiting for my security clearance, about the only unclassified literature I had back in 1948, I guess it was, to read while waiting was a fairly good description of the Mark II. And that was about the time at which I was being very thoughtful about the relay computer, the Simon stuff, and I had begun to think about very small-scale machines. In fact, I went to talk with Severo's now father-in-law, his wife, Laura Gould's father, the very distinguished and famous numerical analyst and mathematician D.H. Lamer, to see whether it would make sense for me to go back to Berkeley. I was then on a leave of absence from the physics department, adjusting my perspective after a bruising experience with a seminar with Oppenheimer, and deciding for myself that I really wasn't all that interested in how the physical world works and how we understand it. But Lamer told me that the thing to do was forget all that small computer stuff, go with the big boys. That's where the action was. And it was shortly after that, in fact, that I went back to MIT, answering an ad for the Digital Computer Laboratory that Jay Forrester and others had put out. And they were good enough to take me. By the way, a story about Howard Aiken, whom I did not meet until many, many years later. It was here at Ricky's, as a matter of fact, out in the lobby. I was with Frank Hart. We were here on an assignment from Lincoln Laboratory, and here for about a week or 10 days, as I recall, back in the days when there were still apricot trees around. There was this distinguished gentleman sitting in the corner, and Frank Hart, you recall, is at Bolt, Brannick, and Newman. Frank was Severo's boss when Severo built the IMP back there at BBN. And a real old-timer in the field. He said to me, "I think that's Howard Aiken in the corner." And I said, "Nonsense. What would an old fart like Harold Aiken be doing in a place like this?" Frank said, "Nonsense. Let's go on over and find out." So we marched over, and I said to this good gentleman, very distinguished fellow, sitting quietly reading, "My friend here says that you're Howard Aiken." Howard said, "I am. I suppose you're wondering what an old fart like me is doing in a place like this." That's really true. Well, let me see. Charlie, good show. Now, if we have this right side up, we do, but it's not the top of the screen. Can you lower that just slightly? Well, you can't. On the top, you would see a couple of LINC tape units. That's a rack of stuff, some of which is a LINC in its rack-mounted arrangement in a typical crowded laboratory. The laboratory problem, unlike that of the sterile environments in which we usually find workstations, is a very cluttered one, and so there's a great premium on space and flexibility in mounting and so on, and often has to live with a lot of other stuff. Sure. Just for you, Bert, I speak up. Or I could just smile. I learned that from North Whitehead, by the way. We traveled together in Germany once on a summer trip. Not Alfred North, of course, his son, who was also a fairly elderly man at the time. He also taught me how to decapitate an egg properly, using something that I've since come to call the Whitehead stroke. But that's a better picture of the LINC. The box is on the left, and I have a pointer, don't I? There's a button. Outstanding. These four boxes taken together are the LINC. What you don't see is another fairly large cabinet that holds the electronics that makes it all go, which we preferred to ignore. This is mostly passive stuff, but you see the tape units, two of them side by side, well, a reel off on either half. There's a console. Those things are no longer with us, of course. There's the gigantic display, a 5-inch Tektronix scope adaptation, and the other box happens to be mostly empty except for two plug-in units, and this plug-in unit has some electronics in it, as is evident by the fact that there are wires coming out the top. That's going off to some other laboratory equipment, and the rest of the stuff there, this is in the laboratory, I think, of Vernon Mountcastle at Johns Hopkins. Does other stuff, and I have no idea what. Well, the LINC is an interesting story all by itself, without regard to whatever influence it may or may not have had upon subsequent developments or how timely it was. But in fact, it almost didn't happen. I am the only person in the world who has been fired by MIT for insubordination 3 times. 2 of those times had to do with the LINC, which got its start at Lincoln Laboratory and was then spelled with small ink, kind of to suggest that it came from Lincoln Laboratory without really saying it was a computer, because computers were beginning to be fearsome words in some lexicons, especially in the biomedical computer world, where scientists could scarcely add, let alone operate digital equipment. And the instrument itself, with the requirement that it be small and compact and flexible and cheap and not really a computer, constituted a kind of a design challenge. And at best, what we could come up with in the short period of time that we worked on this, from 61 to 63, I guess, counting the first modification, the final modification, no, it was the first, was really not all that great to do a very good job, nor did we have parts around that made good sense as they do today, parts like integrated circuits and things like that, or floppy disks even. But we did what we could with what we had. I was then working in a laboratory at Lincoln under the direction of William Papian, here seen at the right. He's the fellow who engineered the first magnetic core array as a graduate student of J. Forrester's, the thing that appeared in the memory test computer, MTC, that Gordon talked about yesterday. And it wouldn't have come about, I suppose, if it hadn't been for interactions with the group at the Communications Biophysics Laboratory under Walter Rosenblith, and that's the gentleman on the left. By the way, I suppose it isn't necessary to identify the others in these photographs. And it was clear that some kind of an instrument that could be used in neurological research going on in Walter's laboratory would be a good thing. And he had declined to take the TX0 when it was made available to him because, as I realized later, almost immediately in fact, it was just too much for him to handle. It was still a bit too much a computer, even though it was the smallest thing around at the time. Not physically, of course. They were still a pretty good rack of stuff. And so the design gimmick that I started with, just because one needs a gimmick to get going, was a kind of a serial parallel scheme, and I've forgotten what these things mean from my laboratory, from my design notebooks of that period. But there's some kind of a function box there and a bus that goes around the outside with a few other distinguished registers here and there. Not so very interesting. It's a 12-bit-ish machine and so forth. The virtue of the thing, if any, resides in the fact that it was all in one package and had everything as a standalone instrument that I thought, playing God, would be necessary to do useful scientific work in the biomedical research laboratory. There's a picture of the tape unit, the first one. I realize we're going to have to be a couple of them, as you see. And the tape reels on the upper right-hand corner there have a tape that simply threads over a head and wraps around the other reel, very much like the unit at the TX2. That unit at the TX2 was something else. 14-inch reels, you don't see these things nowadays, and 3/4-inch tape. That's a very big flywheel. And it worked on the TX2 because the TX2 had the ability to compensate for variations in time, simply taking whatever interrupt came along and processing it on the spot in that crazy multi-sequence operation. Multi-sequence is a terrible name for which I have been doing penance ever since. But it worked when it did work quite well. When it was being developed by Tom Stockybrand and Dick Best and others, aided by Bill Gooms, a wonderful technician who happened to be a chain smoker, it wasn't clear whether it was going to work or not. And in fact, when one would ask Tom along the course of the development whether it was ready to use yet, and if so, how much of it could we use, he would say, well, try to stay away from the ends. This tape traveled over the head at a speed of 60 miles an hour. And sometimes it would have to reverse. The whole thing would go. Well, Larry Roberts and others here, I'm sure, will remember how that thing worked. Part of its control mechanism, it did not attempt to control speed, by the way, except roughly speaking, but rather the tape tension. That was the important parameter to control. You don't want the tape to break. Part of that control mechanism, however, did involve a small mirror, as Charlie was just telling us a couple of days ago, just under the ledge on which Bill Gooms used to rest his cigarette, with the occasional consequence that some ashes would obscure the reflective path in which the mirror participated, and the thing would go out of control and whap, 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 whap off the end, breaking off a neat segment of tape for every revolution at high speed and going for approximately half an hour, filling the room to roughly knee depth of little snippets of tape. The LINC tape unit, on the other hand, was supposed to be a small, not just a small scale version of that giant for the TX2, but something that you could, something that would produce reels that you could put in your pocket and carry away with you. That was based on my conviction that it was a lot safer to have your own record in your own pocket than it was in a shared file system, at least at that time. I think that's still true, by the way. At least it's your responsibility if things don't work out. Well, a somewhat later picture from my notebook shows the tape unit again, but I was beginning to see how hard it was going to be to design this thing. But we got it. And there's a summary page in the paper that gives you a quick tour through that process. It did, in fact, finally work. I made sure that it worked with ashes, by the way. I remember one demonstration in which I took an ashtray full of cigarette butts and ashes, not mine, I'm a pipe smoker, and dumped it on the head, to the horror of the observers who had come from, some of whom had come from the computation center environment, and then proceeded to wipe my finger across the head to clean the tape, clean the head, and then we loaded the tape on it, and it ran like a charm. By the way, that thing was very redundant and very conservatively designed, and you could read and write through a piece of paper between the tape and the head. Because I was told that an important spec to observe was that it should be able to read through spilled blood. Well, a principal figure in the development was Tom Sandel, here seen at the right, talking to a member of Mountcastle's laboratory in a subsequent summer. Tom Sandel died, unfortunately, just a few years ago, but he was one of the research workers in Rosenblith's laboratory and came to Lincoln to help us work out some ideas about how to make instruments that were really appropriate for laboratory use. And it was partly in connection with a proposal to build a so-called wet lab. I suppose there is the term wetware around now, isn't there? A wet lab next to the TX2 for some biological work that precipitated the laboratory management's decision to let us go. And we moved. We moved down to Cambridge to Kendall Square from Lexington, and there put together the LINC in a very short time. That is the final design of the LINC. This was not until after we had demonstrated a prototype, and there are a couple of anecdotes in the paper I think you may find amusing about how we took the LINC to Washington for a demonstration and connected it to a cat at NIH with implanted electrodes. That was sort of fun. It worked right off, and we got some nice average responses from a set of 4. I think we picked 4 channels through the A to D converters built into the front of the LINC. 4 channels of behavior of physiological signals from the implanted electrode array, which was somewhat larger than that, in the cat. While the cat did his usual thing, and he had been quite accustomed to this, not the computers, of course, but the cables, which came out of his head. And so he walked around and behaved, and the LINC displayed this stuff, and the principal in the laboratory, Dr. Robert Livingston, was ecstatic, as you can tell from at least his memory of that occasion that's published in the paper. Just after that, we had an open house. He was so pleased. And we invited everybody from NIH, including a good many from the Computation Center and its operation, to come and visit. And so they did, and they came and saw the LINC here, and the cat there, and the cable going from the cat to the LINC, and the waveforms displayed on the screen. And I remember one guy walking all around the instrument. He looked under and over and around in the back of the room and so forth, looked at the cat, looked at the LINC, and he said, well, how do you get the data in? By the way, about design measures, one precursor to the LINC was a very, very small machine called the L1. Gordon mentioned measuring computers by the foot. I think the L1 was a 10-bit machine. That would not have been a 10-footer, Gordon. It was just a little fellow. But I do remember keeping track of such things as the number of square inches of paper, scratch paper, in my notebook, devoted to various parts of the design throughout the process, which was a very short-term one because it was a very small and very simple machine. 10-bit machine with 2 bits of order code and a few other second-rank bits for microprogramming, that sort of thing. And I also kept track of the size of in the finished machine that the various parts would take, and I also kept track of I made various homunculi, you see, pictures showing to distorted scale how much these things took according to various measures. The measures were the square inches of scratch paper, the size in the box, the number of aspirin I consumed during the design process, and so on. And I had a series of drawings, and it was quite an interesting set of measures. By that token, of course, the input-output control design for a Kleinschmidt teletypewriter, which was the entirety of the thing's input-output system, occupied the biggest chunk. No doubt about that. If you do the same thing for the LINC, then of course you'd find that the bulk of the design effort went into 2 parts. One was the magnetic tape system, and the other was the console. You wouldn't think a console would be that hard to design. So just a bunch of switches and lights and things indicating the states of various registers. But I was very anxious to make it sort of idiot-proof, relatively foolproof, so that that even the biological experimenter could manipulate those switches without causing crashes of his own stuff or without getting confusing reports from the machine. The tape unit was complicated because of its ability to manipulate blocks of fixed information on the tape, a block being arbitrarily chosen on the basis of a pre-recorded timing track and a block mark structure, kind of a backbone down the tape. And the ability to control the flow, the transfer between the tape and the central memory. There was just one memory, 1,000 words of 12 bits. supplemented by a second 1,000 in an option, controlling transfers back and forth by a single instruction, so that the entire control was not microcoded, it was wired in. And it wasn't programmed, it was wired in. The wiring and the working out of those control details took a bit of time, but we pretty much got it right. Those tape units are very remarkable and very reliable. They were copied some years later by, I guess DEC continued to make them under the name DEC tape, or a version of them under the name DEC tape. I have to be careful because there was a lawsuit involving another company that DEC claimed was infringing a patent that DEC subsequently applied for on the LINC tape unit, to the patent office's subsequent dismay. But another company did form and sold them to DEC's competitor, Data General, for a while, as I recall. In fact, that's probably what got DEC's attention on that lawsuit case. We had as you see in the paper, we had an active summer in 1963 when biological research workers chosen on the basis of a national solicitation of proposals came to Cambridge and put together their own machines. And there are some pictures in the paper showing people putting machines together. They did it in a 1-month schedule, including teaching. Some of them had never seen a computer before. I have the feeling some of them have never seen a number before, actually. By the way, during that design phase, I can't resist Severo. This is such a charming picture of an early Severo on the left, explaining a last-minute problem that we ran into to Jerry Cox of Washington, chairman of computer science at Washington University, who, more than any other single factor, with the exception of George Paik, who was then provost at Washington University, was responsible for the LINC design team's subsequent move to St. Louis to set up the computer systems laboratory, which we did in the summer of 1964. By the way, that's Mary Ellen Wilkes, the principal, if not the only operating system programmer for the LINC during that period of time, conducting a class, I should say. The title of this one is, "And Now, Children, the Little Bear Said to the Big Bear," or something like that. Teaching a class of visitors. It was fairly tiring, by the way. I took the next year off in a state of depression when MIT found it necessary for a second time to let us go. We found a new home, as I say, in St. Louis, but not until after a very long and very dispiriting search. We moved to the Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children in St. Louis, next to the medical school at Washington University. It's a fine old building, but it had been left vacant in the very humid weather of St. Louis for a few years, and so it needed a little work. But we got it up and did indeed finish the program, including some redesign activities to make sure that the links, about 20 or so of which were then out abroad in the country, were kept up to date and worked well and so forth. Severo will remember this period very well indeed. In fact, this is a little out of order, but that's a picture of the screen taken with 4x6 dot matrix characters from the Tektronix CRT and photographed with Polaroid camera, and that's a histogram. I guess the quality was, this was the standard point display technique that we used on all the MIT machines, and it's a very sound one. Trips made to laboratories. Here, Severo visiting the laboratory of Alan Bonneau. You see that the boxes could be stacked in arbitrary ways. That's a stack instead of a side-by-side arrangement, and they could be put in relay racks and so forth. Here's a picture of a very famous neurophysiologist, Jersey Rose, at the University of Wisconsin, deep at work, and his stuff is embedded in a rack at that point, as you see. Well, we went on over the years, making modifications, getting the thing established. The LINC had some influence on some subsequent DEC machines. I'm sure it influenced the PDP-12, which followed from the LINC 8, something that Dick Clayton at DEC and I did. I did it sort of to keep DEC's interest alive in the LINC logic, because it was then beginning to wander rightly so, to the PDP-8. And so I said, well, let's just marry these two and put them in one box, and that'll keep the interest going a little longer. About 150 of those were made, and then subsequently, in redesigned form, the PDP-12 was made, designed by Dick Clayton, and then I guess about 1,000 of those were made. Well, these things were out there. They began to result in a lot of very solid scientific work, and that's not a direct concern to those of us in the profession who are more interested in the computerological aspects of things, but in fact, it has been responsible for a great deal of stuff in the published literature. We tried to keep track of that for a while, but finally gave up because it was simply growing too rapidly, and there were too many people using the machine and doing good stuff with it for us to attempt to keep track of it. We wanted to do that for a while because it's hard to find references in the scientific literature to the apparatus used in the course of the research that's reported, and so we wanted to track that for a while so that we had some body of knowledge about that, and that was done for a bit. But we got confusing letters from time to time. This is one that came from, doesn't say so, well, it's the it's an alcoholic rehabilitation center, and you probably can't read it, but I'll read it to you. It was addressed, we received this, I forget, sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. Dear Sirs, this was addressed, by the way, to LINC, the Laboratory Instrument Computer of Wisconsin Hospital, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Massachusetts Avenue, Cambridge. Dear Sirs, Dr. S. Cohen, Director of Rehabilitation of the Center, is desirous of receiving the following. Digital computer, 4 keys, yes, no, don't understand. Your prompt attention to this request would be very much appreciated. Well, that's really all that I have to say. I should, I suppose, respond, and maybe I can in questions, if anybody cares, to some of the things that were being discussed about technology transfer and the TX2, and there are weird stories about Whirlwind, which I'm sure many of, well, not many, some of you will surely know, and so on. But with that, I guess I can conclude. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions? Robert.
Wow.
Tell us what prompted you to do 2 things with regard to the LINC. One, you put a knob on it that could control the speed of the processor or an accumulator or something, so that in effect you could, since I'm one of the few people in the room who may have actually used this machine, I was entranced by the notion that you could speed up or slow down the processor and consequently see a character or whatever you were putting up on the display either gradually and incrementally build itself up into a character or not. And so the reason that you put this speed up, slow down accelerator on the machine, I think would be of interest. And the other question is, why did you put a loudspeaker on it? I recall, you look surprised, I recall there being a loudspeaker, maybe I'm thinking of the TX2, but on the LINC, I think there was a loudspeaker where you could hear the machine process, and in fact, as you crank this speed knob up or down, why, you would hear the concomitant resulting sound through the loudspeaker. What were your reasons for doing these 2 rather interesting things that I think machines even today we could have a lot of fun with if they were so instrumented?
Well, that's in fact the answer. I thought it would be fun. I thought it would be fun. I put audio channels on all of my machines. It's actually very useful, as has been observed here already, to have any kind of feedback cues you need or can get from complex systems that are complex at the time. This thing is, of course, just a toy now. It's just scarcely a bump in a cable, except for the tape unit. But speed control is also a useful thing in order to teach people how the instruction cycle worked and what instructions did and so forth, and to get to help to cement the perception of the speed of the machine. You know, we live in such a narrow perceptual world. We can't see flowers bloom except by stop motion, and we can't see very fast things. You know, we just have this little window from a few seconds to a few minutes, and we get bored, or we're just not fast enough to capture high-speed phenomena. And so anything you can do to make things more understandable, especially if you're teaching people who have had no exposure to computing machinery before, the better off you are. That's all. It's very simple. And also, of course, at high speed, the things weren't in the audio range, if you, for the most part, depending on what bit you listen to. So you slow it down so that you can put things into the audio range.
Well, I'm sure everybody is reading between the lines on Wes's modest presentation of this stuff, but I just have to react to the feelings of another user of that machine, which was me, when I started doing this stuff at Xerox. And you have to realize that the experience of using the LINC was like using a rather large microcomputer today. And in fact, the description, it looks like it couldn't do anything. It only had 1K and it had these tape units. But in fact, the integration of the software and hardware was so clever that you could go along and do all of the operations of editing your code and loading it and running it, and the tape unit was going back and forth. The directory of the tape unit was located in the center of the tape, and so they'd work. There was this beautiful interleaved code for going back and forth and finding things. It was essentially a virtual memory on this little machine. And the machine, I think people would be hard-pressed to do the same on 100K bytes today. I mean, we live in an era in which it takes 20,000 transistors to make a flush toilet. And I think that the thing that is really worthwhile in studying of the LINC is to understand that this system was incredibly useful. And it's in some sense a kind of, I think of it as kind of the two-part invention of the computer field. It's the entire universe in its outline. And that's the best kind of universe you can ever have.
Wow, Alan. Would you like some? There are a few around still.
I would indeed.
I'd like to make one or two other comments. I think one thing that's interesting, the concept, you had built a special purpose computer for the neurophysiologist, and I think the idea that it ended up being limiting and that you wanted to use a general purpose computer for that purpose is an at that time was, since everybody was in the special purpose digital computers were being used rather extensively, was a good concept and a breakthrough one. Another thing I wanted to say, when you came to UCLA quite a couple of times in 60, 61, and I remember one of the times you discussed your LINC in the tape drive, and I remember having the audacity to suggest, like, well, why don't you make this IBM compatible? And I had forgotten this, but I remember your answer and the vehemence with which you wouldn't entertain that idea. And so today, when you started to say you had an IBM Selectric typewriter, I was going to go up and say to you, see, IBM does do something you liked, and then you did that punchline yourself.
Probe that one a little more, Wes. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask you for a long time, if we go back, I was not at all closely associated with any of this, but I did show up occasionally as members of site visit teams and sort of see what was going on. So I had this kind of vision. And I had the experience that Thelma related on a number of occasions, in which there was kind of an immense anti-IBM rhetoric that ran, and it wasn't just Wes, it was through the whole team, which was that IBM has this view that the only way you compute is through punch cards, and I don't need to repeat the rhetoric, there was always some nice hints about it. But the question I'm after is if you take that, plus the other thing that was clearly going on with the LINC effort, which was that the whole attempt was slaved so closely with trying to help the biological scientists do their work. So there was a way in which the inspiration for lots of what was going on was, how do we build an instrument computer? Okay, and that kind of global view drove it. And the question I'd like to ask is you now reflect back on it some years after the fact, how important do you believe the sort of anti-IBM ideology was in driving the design? And how important, and how much do you think that really wasn't important at all? And how much do you think it was really the fact that you had deeply immersed yourself in the biologist problems, the issue of the better instrument, and thus we're using that to drive the to drive the whole effort. It seems to me that is related to the question. It's very related to what Butler was saying as well of, we just didn't think of doing the spreadsheet. That really represents some of the park ideologies that have you pick up some things and not others. And it seems to me that that's actually worth a few remarks now that you've got a little distance. Apparently not too much distance yet, but at least a little distance between you and those early set of feelings which were right on the surface, I mean, all the time.
Well, first of all, Alan, I think we were too busy in that period to notice what IBM was doing, and we were off in a different area. These were real-time control systems. I'm speaking now of the computer development group there under Bill Papian and others. Magnetic core memory, you know, that work came out of the immediately preceding year or two, but it wasn't till a few years later that that IBM decided that they would make magnetic core memories for the I guess it was the 701, wasn't it, that turned, which had electrostatic storage up to that point. And they did so only after I've forgotten who it was, International Telemeter Magnetics or something out here began to make memory units and sell them to as replacement units for IBM electrostatic storage, that IBM began to pick that up and decided they ought to market them themselves. I think I have that right. But no, our world in the real-time control stuff and the business machine world simply did not intersect, that's all. And it was, if one thing was clear, that you could not do the kind of thing online in the laboratory, hands-on experiments where you could make mistakes and correct them on the spot with machinery buffered from you by intermediate ranks of either of operators or of intermediating equipment in formats that were inappropriate to the real world of the laboratory. I will admit to some, how should I put this, less than full enthusiasm for some of the activities that have found their way into the commercial world through the, well, let's say not all of the commercial world, but just that part, as Dan Slotnick once said, that part of the commercial world in computers that has, say, more than 50% of the market. I'm sorry, what? Well, it was 50%. In the LINC situation, I think things were moving. What would one have done, Alan? It's a little. How would one have seen these influences interact? I don't quite know.
Well, I mean,
I might say, by the way, that one of the early things done when the LINCs were out in the field, out there, not snuggled next to, but not all that far from computation centers with powerful machinery in blue tape format. One of the first things done was to put the half a dozen plug-in units together that made an interface to a IBM compatible tape unit, so that people could take data off for more mathematical massage and that sort of thing.
I mean, there are, if you ask what would be done, I mean, one of the things that impressed me at the time was the extent to which, when one interacted with these groups, the issue of trying to find another way of doing business that was more appropriate, not concerned with the chorus here at all, but really concerned with the interface, with the way of interaction, with the style of interaction, and a kind of a generalized unhappiness with the rest of the world. It did not make, in fact, the IBM world seem so far away. It was, in fact, a way that one was trying to find alternatives to. And that was certainly a lot, I mean, that talk was there all the time. And that's my recollection of it now. It may not have been, but it was there all the time. And I was just, and one could have said that one could react to the punch card world. Let me just use the word punch card world, because it's the interface that counts here. The punch card world, and be looking for alternatives. In some sense, what we've had from Doug Engelbart is kind of a picture of the model of the world he built for himself, which was nowhere satisfied anywhere around, that then drove him to try and find a way of realizing that. And one could have seen that, and I thought at the time, sort of youngster that I was and didn't know any better, that was actually one of the things that was driving you guys. And one could also take the view that that was, as you just now did, that that wasn't at all what was going on. It was really that you had, as you also did clearly, really decided that that instrumentation problem in the life sciences laboratory was the real, and just following that grail then led you down all these paths, and you just didn't care about the rest of this. And I was just interested if and you probably see it quite different than I did at the time, pretty clearly, because I just sort of bounced against you guys every renewal period.
Al, I really don't know how to assess that and digest that and respond properly. I can only say that I guess I just never paid much attention to what the limitations of the existing equipment were, except for the fact that you couldn't get your hands on them. You couldn't use them on your own terms, make your own mistakes with them without involving anybody else. I think that's what personal means. You want to be able to blow it all by yourself, and on your own terms. But I mean, no speaker to Fortran. I've just never been part of that culture, and I know that at one point, in the display, the cathode ray tube display, which is so central to what we now do, absolutely essential. The one thing you must have, no matter what else, is some way of presenting visual information for that very wide band we got in the head, into the head. I remember a visit from some dignitaries from the International Business Machines Corporation who came to see the TX2 at one point and said that they had heard that we were using displays, various kinds, and they wanted to know what that was all about, because that wasn't something that they did at the time. I think shortly thereafter a display monitor appeared on top of the 709 cabinet, just the one, and of course it atrophied shortly thereafter because it was of no use to anybody. And you have to be pointed toward interactive use of machines before you know that display is that essential thing that you must have.
Take one or two more.
Well, just a short, I really believe in this idea that genre controls how you see things, and I think it's by finding a genre that you get the degrees of freedom to actually do something within it, that you can't look at everything in the world. I think my favorite example from the late 60s was a machine put out by IBM called the 1130, which in fact, if you look at it, it looks like the personal workstation that we talk about today. It has a keyboard, and it had the first one of those Model 30 disk drives that we used on the Alto, designed for that machine. And that, in fact, was the machine that we did the prototyping of the Flex machine on. And I was astounded to discover that there was only one way, and one way only, of programming that machine, and it was via punch cards. And in fact, the way the keyboard could not connect. There was no piece of software that allowed you to ever type a piece of code. So what it was actually a small operator console, and you were expected to do your programs offline, put them onto the disk in binary form, and then some operator would invoke them to run. And in fact, the genre was so strong in this machine that when you typed something on the keyboard, guess what was put into the A register of that machine? It was not a 6-bit number, not a 7-bit number, not an 8-bit number, but a 12-bit number. Now, I'll leave you to figure out what those 12 bits actually were.
I think I'm the only person in the room who was fortunate enough to have worked for a number of years both for Wesley and for Bob Taylor, and in fact also for Frank Hart in between. Sometimes I think that's all I've done. I wanted to respond first of all to your comment about Aiken and having met him here with a short story about my father-in-law, who we were picking up at the airport at one point. And he seemed to be engaged with a man, in conversation with a man in the airport, and we finally had to go in and pluck him away, because apparently this man had gone up to Dick Lamer and said to him, "Are you Mr. Brown?" And Dick had responded by saying, "No, are you?" And they then fell into a conversation. It's a total stranger. I wanted to say that I think when that picture of Wes looking very depressed was taken, I walked into his office one day, and he was looking very much like that, and I asked him why he was so unhappy, and he stood there shaking his head, and I remember he said to me, "Charlie thinks I know what I'm doing." I have two more short ones. I think these are actually germane and important. I don't know whether Wesley remembers all these things. I also, once when we were building the LINC in the first place, went into a very dark room one night. I didn't know Wesley was in there, and I discovered that the monitor for the machine was removed and was sitting down on the floor under a table. It was pitch black in the room, and Wesley was sitting in front of it, twiddling the dials and muttering to himself, "First you got to get its attention." I think the most important thing I learned both from Wesley and then later from Bob was that a thing that Wes said, that most of what he does is for fun, and I think that's really the key to success in all of these things, and I certainly learned that as hard as I could from Wes in the years I worked for him. So, thanks.
Glad you're having fun, sir.
I think in terms of the concept that was brought up yesterday, in terms of how many days or years the person has changed the field, Wes has to take the cake because at being at least a 15-year person, because of all of the machines and all of the people those affected, certainly everything that I've done in my life has been profoundly affected by Wes, and similarly, I think all of us coming out of Lincoln and MIT have been profoundly affected by the things that were done, including the early developments of putting together the core memories on through the TX0 and the TX2 and those machines, as well as the LINC and the later efforts, certainly affected the momentum of history tremendously throughout everything, including, I think, impacting IBM in the long run.